In the world's most prestigious concert hall, a famous pianist laughs as Keanu Reeves steps onto the stage, certain the actor will embarrass himself. The crowd whispers. The judges sneer. What business does he have at a grand piano? But when Keanu begins to play, something happens that no one in the room can explain. Before we continue this incredible story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow we have another inspiring story you won't want to miss. The Grand International Piano Gala was no ordinary concert. It was the sanctuary of tradition, a place where every note carried the weight of centuries. Crystal chandeliers hung like frozen constellations, scattering light over velvet seats filled with dignitaries, wealthy patrons, and critics whose words could build or destroy reputations. The scent of polished wood and expensive perfume mingled in the air, creating an atmosphere of elegance so rigid it felt suffocating. This was not merely an evening of music, it was a ceremony, a ritual that demanded reverence. At the heart of this temple of sound sat Maestro Viktor Armand. For decades, his name had commanded the piano world like a sovereign king. His fingers had once graced the ivory keys with such mastery that audiences across Europe had risen in thunderous ovations. Now older, with silver streaking his black hair and the faint lines of age carved into his sharp face, Viktor had traded the stage for the judge's box. His eyes, still sharp and unyielding, scanned the performers with the precision of a hawk circling prey. He had spent his life guarding the sanctity of classical music, scorning anyone who dared dilute it with novelty or mediocrity. Beside him sat Madame Elise Dubois, her posture straight as a sword. Her reputation was nearly as severe as his own. Where Viktor was flamboyant in his disdain, Elise was cold, silent, and unrelenting. For 50 years she had defined what excellence in music meant, and her judgments had shattered the dreams of countless aspiring musicians. Between the two of them, the stage was less a platform for performance and more an altar where only the worthy could stand. As the evening unfolded, performer after performer took the stage. A young prodigy from Vienna brought Chopin to life with delicate phrasing, his notes shimmering like sunlight on water. A fiery pianist from Spain thundered through Liszt, drawing murmurs of approval from the audience. Viktor nodded sparingly, his lips thin, his judgment always hovering between brilliance and disappointment. To be acknowledged by him was a prize in itself, and the young musicians who had prepared their entire lives leaned into their bows, desperate for even the smallest flicker of his approval. But the true weight of the night was yet to come. The announcer's voice, smooth and formal, echoed across the gilded hall. And now, a special guest performer, Mr. Keanu Reeves. The reaction was instant. Murmurs spread like wildfire through the crowd. Heads turned, eyebrows rose, whispers crackled between patrons like sparks in dry grass. Keanu Reeves, the actor? Some chuckled outright, others exchanged looks of disbelief. In the judge's box, Viktor Armand let out a sharp laugh, the sound carrying with a bite of scorn. He leaned toward Madame Dubois, his words dripping with mockery. A movie star? This is theater, not music. Elise did not laugh. Her eyes narrowed to icy slits as she stared at the stage. To her, this was worse than a joke. This was an insult to the legacy she had spent her life defending. A Hollywood figure, stepping into a place reserved for the chosen few, was nothing short of sacrilege. The crowd grew restless as they awaited his entrance. To them, this was entertainment of a different kind. Would he stumble? Would he embarrass himself? The thought of watching a world-famous actor humiliate himself in front of the harshest critics. Alive was a spectacle, almost as thrilling as the music itself. Backstage, Keanu prepared to step into a world where he was not welcome. The heavy velvet curtain stirred as Keanu stepped forward. The grand hall seemed to inhale as one, a collective breath held in disbelief. He was dressed simply in a black suit, his dark hair falling loosely around his face. There was no dramatic entrance, no flamboyant gesture, no trace of the arrogance so many expected. He walked with quiet composure, a man accustomed to the glare of cameras but not to the cold scrutiny of this kind of audience. The crowd's whispers swelled. Some laughed under their breath. Others shook their heads in pity. This was a sacred stage where children had sacrificed childhoods for a chance to sit before the gleaming keys, and here was an outsider, a man whose fame came from action films and Hollywood lights. To many, it was nothing short of mockery. Keanu paused at center stage, his hands at his sides, and gave a small bow. It was not the bow of a seasoned pianist, but of a man offering respect to something greater than himself. His eyes swept across the hall rows of jewel-toned gowns, tuxedos, and faces etched with skepticism. He said nothing, but his presence alone seemed to challenge the unspoken decree that only the elite could belong here. From the judge's box, Viktor smirked, his lips curling with condescension. He leaned back in his chair, tapping his fingers against the velvet armrest as if already composing his dismissal in his mind. To him, this was theater. A curiosity to fill the evening with easy ridicule. A man who pretends on screen now, pretends on stage, he muttered, just loud enough for those around him to hear. Madame Dubois remained motionless, her icy gaze fixed on Keanu. Her silence spoke louder than Viktor's mockery. For her, this intrusion was not humorous, it was offensive. She had spent her life protecting the purity of classical music, and this intrusion from a Hollywood star was an affront she could not forgive. The announcer's voice rang once more, formal and cutting in its clarity. Mr. Reeves will perform Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major. A hush fell. All eyes turned back to Keanu as he moved toward the gleaming concert grand. He adjusted the bench with quiet precision, no flourish, no delay. His movements were efficient, almost awkward, lacking the practiced grace of the performers who had come before him. To the audience, it confirmed what they already believed. He didn't belong. As he placed his hands above the keys, the hall seemed to lean forward in anticipation, eager for the disaster to unfold. Somewhere in the back rows, a nervous laugh broke the silence. A critic scribbled a note even before the first sound was made. This was not music, they thought. This was spectacle. A carnival act dressed in black. But Keanu's face remained calm, almost serene. He exhaled slowly, and his fingers touched the ivory. The first notes drifted into the air, delicate and precise. At once, the crowd recognized the piece. Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major was a choice steeped in tradition, revered for its emotional depth and lyrical beauty. It was the kind of music that revealed the soul of the performer. Yet from Keanu's hands, the notes emerged like reflections on glass. Perfect in placement, flawless in timing, but strangely empty. The audience exchanged glances. This was not the raw passion of Chopin. This was not the tender intimacy that stirred hearts. It was clean, accurate, and utterly lifeless, as though a machine were playing in his stead. Murmurs rippled through the hall, whispers laced with disdain. Viktor leaned forward, a smile tugging at his lips. This was exactly what he expected, and the confirmation pleased him. Mechanical, he whispered to Dubois, his voice sharp as a knife. No breath, no spirit. A child reciting lines without knowing their meaning. He sat back with satisfaction, already certain of the verdict he would write. Madame Dubois' eyes narrowed. She watched, not just with her ears, but with her entire body, listening for the resonance that told her whether an artist had given themselves to the piece. With Keanu, she found none. His expression remained composed, unflinching, almost detached. The performance was a polished shell without a heart. She made her note with swift, precise strokes. Technically correct, artistically void. The audience's response mirrored the judges'. There was no sigh of delight, no collective exhale of wonder. Instead, restlessness stirred in the velvet rows. Someone in the balcony stifled a laugh. A man near the front shifted impatiently, shaking his head. The promise of scandal and humiliation seemed to be unfolding exactly as anticipated. Yet Keanu did not falter. He played each measure with the same steady calm, refusing to rush, refusing to stumble. He neither sought to impress nor to defend himself. He was simply there, his fingers moving with unerring discipline, until the final chord faded into silence. For a moment, there was nothing. Then a smattering of polite applause began, awkward and subdued. It was the kind of response reserved for mediocrity, given more out of courtesy than admiration. It died quickly, swallowed by the weight of disappointment. Keanu stood, bowed slightly once more, and walked away from the piano. His steps were unhurried, his shoulders straight, his face unreadable. He gave nothing to the audience, no apology, no arrogance, no plea for recognition, only silence. In the judge's box, Victor allowed himself a quiet chuckle, the sound of victory claimed. He leaned to Dubois, voice dripping with derision. A movie star indeed. Theater, not music. Dubois' lips curved into the faintest shadow of agreement. Her silence was harsher than any insult. In her eyes, Keanu had committed the gravest sin of all. He had come before them, not as an artist, but as an imposter. The curtain fell on his preliminary performance, and the hall returned to its glittering ritual. But beneath the polished surface, a storm was gathering, though none in that moment could see it. The hall was still buzzing from the awkward silence that had followed the announcement of his name. Whispers darted across the velvet rows like restless birds, each one carrying doubt, curiosity, or disdain. Yet as Keanu Reeves stepped onto the stage, he carried himself with a simplicity that cut through the murmur of voices. He did not attempt to dazzle with charisma, nor did he bow with the flourish of a trained virtuoso. He walked quietly, almost modestly, his black suit unadorned, his shoes polished but plain, and his face calm. His arrival was not a performance in itself. It was the entrance of a man who did not care to impress the elite staring down at him from golden balconies. He moved as though he had stepped onto countless stages before, but never one like this. There were no cameras flashing, no red carpets to roll beneath his feet, and no cheering fans pressing at the velvet ropes. Instead, there were the unyielding eyes of critics, patrons, and musicians who measured worth in crescendos and cadences, not in box office numbers. He paused at the center, placed his hands together briefly, and gave a small bow. It was understated, a gesture of respect rather than showmanship. Yet instead of inspiring admiration, it triggered soft laughter in corners of the hall. To them, it looked clumsy, like an actor trying to imitate the grace of those who had lived and breathed music since childhood. From her seat, Madame Dubois observed him with that infamous stare of hers. The stern lines of her face deepened, her disapproval clear even before the first note was played. She was the guardian of tradition, a woman who had grown into her authority like a suit of armor. For her, the piano was not just an instrument. It was a sacred trust passed down by the masters. To see it, now placed beneath the hands of a man whose life had been spent in front of film cameras, was, in her mind, unthinkable. At her side, Maestro Viktor Armand leaned back with a smirk. He whispered loud enough for nearby ears to catch. The actor bows like he is greeting fans at a premiere. This will be amusing. His silver eyebrows arched with delight as he folded his arms across his chest, ready to relish the spectacle of humiliation. The announcer's voice rose again, carrying the weight of ceremony. The preliminary piece is Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major. The hall grew quiet, though not with reverence. It was the kind of hush that came before expected failure. People leaned forward, eager to watch the stumble they were certain was coming. Madame Dubois addressed him directly, her voice cool, carrying easily through the room. "Mr. Reeves, are you prepared?" Keanu looked up, his dark eyes calm. His voice was quiet, almost gentle, yet clear enough to reach every corner of the gilded hall. "Yes, madame." And with that, he turned to the piano. The concert grand gleamed under the chandelier light, its polished surface reflecting the tension that hung in the air. Keanu adjusted the bench with a quiet motion, sliding it a few inches, then sitting with his back straight but not rigid. There was no theatrics in his posture, no sweeping gesture of hands raised above the keys like a seasoned performer ready to enthrall. Instead, there was simplicity. He placed his feet firmly on the pedals, lifted his hands, and hovered just above the ivory. For a heartbeat, The entire hall held still. Dozens of eyes locked on him, waiting for the inevitable stumble. Somewhere in the balcony, a whisper broke through the silence. "This will be painful." A few stifled laughs followed, the kind of laughter people share when they believe they already know the ending to a story. Madame Dubois leaned slightly forward, her pen poised over her score sheet. She did not expect artistry. She expected proof of her belief that tradition must be defended against intruders. Her lips pressed into a thin line as she braced herself for what she believed would be the desecration of Chopin's work. Keanu drew in a slow breath, then lowered his hands. The first notes drifted out, soft and perfectly aligned. Each tone landed in its rightful place, steady, exact, and faithful to the page. But from the first measures, it was clear to those who lived and breathed music that something essential was missing. The nocturne was meant to sound like a sigh, a voice whispering its secrets in the quiet of the night. In Keanu's hands, it sounded like a transcription. The notes were there, precise and clean, but stripped of the delicate tenderness that made Chopin eternal. There was no rubato, no gentle stretching of time to breathe emotion into the spaces between. It was mechanical perfection, but it was lifeless. The audience's discomfort was almost palpable. Some shifted in their seats, others shook their heads faintly. Viktor Armand let out a soft chuckle, audible enough to draw knowing glances from nearby patrons. He leaned toward Dubois and murmured, "Just as expected, an actor reciting lines he does not understand." Dubois did not smile, but her silence spoke volumes. She wrote swiftly in her notes, the ink flowing across the page in sharp strokes. Correct, not inspired, no feeling, lacks artistry. Keanu did not look at the audience. His eyes stayed low, his concentration fixed on the keys. He neither sought to sway them with dramatic flourishes nor looked for their approval. He played steadily, never faltering, each phrase executed exactly as written, but with the emotional weight of a rehearsal etude. For the young prodigies who had already performed that night, pouring heart and soul into their interpretations, the contrast was stark. They had bared their lives in each note. He, by comparison, seemed to be demonstrating discipline without emotion. The murmurs grew, spreading across the balconies and echoing faintly off the golden walls. Still, Keanu pressed forward, unshaken, each note as deliberate as the last. As the nocturne unfolded, the atmosphere in the hall shifted from restless expectation to a quiet sort of pity. The audience had come hoping to see brilliance or at least a spectacular failure. Instead, they were watching something oddly in between, a performance too precise to collapse but too hollow to inspire. It was like watching a man read poetry in a foreign language, pronouncing every word correctly yet failing to understand a single line. The beauty of Chopin's work lay not in perfection, but in vulnerability. His music demanded a pulse, a human breath, a confession whispered through sound. Without it, the notes became shells, beautiful on the outside, but empty inside. That was what they were hearing now, a flawless shell. Viktor Armand's smirk widened as the piece continued. He leaned back in his velvet chair, arms crossed, savoring the moment. For years, he had been the self-appointed guardian of the art, the judge who could cut through vanity with a single phrase. And tonight, he believed, he was being handed an easy victory. "This is what happens when fame confuses itself with talent," he whispered, his voice thick with disdain. Madame Dubois did not indulge in mockery. Her expression remained sharp, her notes on the page crisp and unforgiving. She was not amused, she was insulted. For her, the piano was sacred, and watching it reduced to an exercise in mechanical accuracy by a man with no history in the art was nothing less than sacrilege. Her silence carried a judgment heavier than words. As the final phrases approached, Keanu's tempo remained steady, his dynamics carefully controlled but devoid of risk. There were no daring swells of passion, no fragile moments of intimacy. It was exact and nothing more. His fingers, steady as stone, carried him through the final measures until the last chord floated into the air, lingering only as long as the score dictated. For a heartbeat, there was stillness, no breath of wonder, no collective exhale of awe. Then came the applause, thin, scattered, polite. It was the applause given out of courtesy, the kind that acknowledged effort but withheld admiration. It was the applause of dismissal. Keanu stood. He did not bask in the response, nor did he falter under its coldness. He simply bowed, a slight inclination of his head, and turned away from the instrument. His steps across the stage were measured, calm, almost defiant in their lack of drama. In the judge's box, Viktor scribbled a line on his notepad, his smirk never fading. Technically correct, emotionally absent, a movie star's vanity project. Dubois set her pen down without a word. Her silence was enough. Behind him, the whispers swelled again. To the audience, the experiment was over. Keanu Reeves had tried to step into their world, and he had failed to move them. But as he disappeared behind the velvet curtain, there was a stillness in his face, a quiet resolve that suggested the story was far from finished. The curtain had barely closed behind Keanu when the murmurs grew into laughter. It started in low tones, half hidden by the shuffle of feet and the tuning of instruments. Then it spread, gathering confidence, turning into outright jokes exchanged between contestants who had been waiting their turn. They had watched him walk onto the stage with calm composure, had listened to the lifeless precision of his performance, and now, with the safety of distance, they mocked without restraint. "He looked like a mannequin up there," one whispered, leaning close to another with a grin. "All posture, no passion. A Hollywood clown," another added, his voice dripping with arrogance. "Did you see his bow? Like a man greeting fans at a film premiere. He doesn't belong here." The words carried down the hallway, harsh and unfiltered. These were not children mocking a peer. These were musicians who had dedicated their lives to this craft, watching an outsider invade their sanctuary. To them, the ridicule felt justified, almost like a duty to protect the art from intrusion. Reporters had gathered in the wings, sensing an opportunity. They swarmed Maestro Viktor Armand as he exited the hall to take a brief break before the next set of performances. The cameras flashed, and microphones extended toward him. His reputation was built not only on his talent, but also on his brutal honesty, and everyone wanted his reaction to the spectacle they had just witnessed. Viktor, ever theatrical, did not disappoint. He adjusted his silk scarf, his smirk playing at the edges of his mouth, and declared, "Art is sacrifice, not a hobby for actors." His voice carried like a judgment passed down from a throne. "Music demands a lifetime, not a whim. To place a man like that on this stage is to confuse celebrity with genius." The reporters devoured the statement, scribbling furiously, their cameras catching the spark of disdain in his eyes. Within minutes, those words would be repeated in whispers across the gala, and by morning, they would be etched in headlines. Viktor had delivered his verdict, and it was as merciless as the performance had been hollow. Backstage, Keanu heard some of the laughter, though none of the mocking words were directed to his face. He walked quietly down the narrow corridor, his shoulders steady, his expression unchanged. Where another man might have flushed with embarrassment or bristled with anger, he remained composed, carrying himself with the same calm dignity he had shown under the chandeliers. In a quiet corner, away from the noise, Daniel Harper waited for him. Daniel was not dressed like the others, with their polished shoes and stiff collars. He wore a simple jacket, his graying hair swept back, his eyes warm but searching. Years ago, he had been a musician himself, a promising pianist who had abandoned the stage after an accident stole the strength from his hands. Now he lived in the shadow of the music he once loved, mentoring from the sidelines rather than performing in the light. When he saw Keanu, Daniel stepped forward and placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "You held yourself well," Daniel said quietly, his voice meant for Keanu alone. "They may laugh, but they cannot say you faltered. You played with control." That matters. Keanu looked at him, and for the first time since stepping onto the stage, a faint flicker of something deeper passed across his face. Not pride, not anger, but a quiet, unreadable certainty. "They see what I let them see," Keanu replied softly. "The real performance hasn't started." Daniel paused, studying him. There was no bravado in his tone, no arrogance, only calm conviction. And in that moment, Daniel realized there was something more hidden beneath the surface, something none of the mocking voices understood. Keanu had not come to impress them with his first appearance. He had come to build a silence so deep that when he finally broke it, no one would dare laugh again. Daniel's eyes narrowed as he studied Keanu. The man standing before him was calm, almost too calm, like an actor holding back his lines until the final act. Around them, the backstage corridors buzzed with the self-satisfaction of competitors and the hum of journalists chasing quotes. Yet Keanu seemed untouched, as though he were somewhere else entirely, keeping his true intentions buried beneath layers of stillness. "You knew this would happen," Daniel said at last, his voice low so it wouldn't carry. "You walked out there, played like a machine, and let them tear you apart. Why?" Keanu lowered himself onto a wooden chair against the wall. He ran a hand through his dark hair, his movements unhurried. "Because if they underestimate me now, they won't see what's coming. The louder they laugh today, the quieter they'll be tomorrow." The words struck Daniel like a revelation. For weeks he had seen Keanu prepare, practicing tirelessly, approaching the piano not with the flamboyance of a showman, but with the focus of a craftsman. He had questioned why Keanu never let emotion color his rehearsals, why his playing seemed restrained even when he had the capacity for more. Now, the answer came into view. This was strategy. Keanu was playing not just the notes, but the people around him. Through the narrow hallway, a burst of laughter echoed. Two contestants passed by, their whispers dripping with arrogance. Did you see the look on Dubois' face? She couldn't even hide her disgust. "That man doesn't belong within a mile of this hall." The other smirked. "Tomorrow he'll be back in Hollywood, where he belongs. This stage will swallow him whole." Daniel's jaw tightened. He had once known the cruelty of peers who laughed when he faltered, and hearing it again stirred an old ache. He glanced at Keanu, expecting some flicker of irritation. But Keanu's expression remained steady. He sat with his hands folded, loosely, his gaze downward, as though their words were nothing more than dust carried on the wind. "Doesn't it bother you?" Daniel pressed. "The way they look at you? The way they talk?" Keanu finally lifted his eyes. They were calm, but within them was a glint of something stronger than defiance. "If I give weight to their words, I lose focus. They expect anger. They expect shame. But silence unsettles them more." He leaned back in the chair, his voice almost a whisper. "Besides, what they saw tonight was only a shadow. The real performance is still waiting." Daniel let those words settle. He had been around enough performers to know the difference between empty bravado and quiet certainty. What he heard in Keanu's voice was not boastful pride, but the steady confidence of a man who knew exactly what he was doing. And that frightened him in a way, because if Keanu truly had something hidden, something prepared for that final stage, then the storm ahead would shake more than the audience. It would strike at the very guardians of tradition themselves. The backstage corridors grew quieter as the next performer was called onto the stage. Their music drifted faintly through the walls, a passionate swell of sound that made the mockery toward Keanu feel sharper, more pointed. Every note the young pianist played seemed to underline the contrast between authentic artistry and the stiff precision they had just witnessed. For the contestants waiting their turn, the difference felt like vindication. Clusters of performers gathered in corners, speaking in hushed but cutting tones. One young man from Italy, barely 20, smirked as he mimicked Keanu's stiff posture, holding his arms straight and plunking his fingers against an invisible keyboard. His friends erupted in laughter, their whispers cruel but gleeful. To them, the presence of an actor among prodigies was more than a novelty. It was an offense. Their laughter wasn't only directed at Keanu, but at the audacity of anyone who thought artistry could be borrowed, worn like a costume. Nearby, two reporters leaned against the wall, scribbling notes and nodding knowingly. Viktor Armand's biting remark, "Art is sacrifice, not a hobby for actors," was already making the rounds, repeated like scripture. It had weight because it came from him, the maestro whose word was treated like law. Soon it would leave the walls of the gala and echo across the wider world, shaping public opinion before Keanu even had the chance to prove otherwise. Daniel Harper listened, his fists tightening at his sides. He had seen cruelty in the arts before, had felt it sting his own skin when his career ended too soon. Yet hearing it now, directed at Keanu, stirred both anger and unease. Anger at the arrogance, unease because Keanu remained so unshaken. It was as though he had deliberately invited their contempt, chosen to wear ridicule like armor. Daniel leaned toward him, his voice urgent. Keanu, they're sharpening their knives. Every word they speak makes you smaller in their eyes. If you have something, if you're hiding something, you'll need to reveal it before they bury you completely. Keanu's gaze drifted toward the floor. Then, back to Daniel. His expression was unreadable, calm to the point of unsettling. They can only bury what is already dead, he said quietly. I'm very much alive. Daniel studied him, struggling to decide whether the man beside him was reckless or brilliant. The calm certainty in his tone suggested something Daniel could not yet see, a plan hidden beneath layers of silence and humility. He realized then that Keanu wasn't fighting them on their terms. He was waiting, allowing them to trap themselves in arrogance, so that when the moment came, the weight of their underestimation would crush them. The music on stage swelled toward its finale, and the audience erupted in warm applause. The contrast between that ovation and the thin clapping Keanu had received moments earlier was stark, but as the sound filtered backstage, Keanu remained still, his hands resting loosely in his lap, his face as steady as stone. And in that silence, Daniel finally understood. The performance the world had just mocked was never meant to win. It was meant to deceive. 6 months earlier, the world outside Keanu's home was still and quiet. The Los Angeles night pressed gently against the windows, the city humming in the distance, but inside his home, it was silent. He sat alone at his wooden desk, a single lamp casting a soft golden light across its surface. Before him lay an old notebook, the edges frayed, its pages yellowed by time. It had belonged to his mother. He opened it with the same care he might have shown an antique book in a library, his fingers brushing the pages as if they could still hold her touch. The handwriting was delicate, slanted, alive with the personality of the woman who had written it. He read line after line until his eyes settled on a passage written years ago, one that seemed to leap out from the page with a clarity that pierced him. Music, she had written, is the language of healing. Even when words cannot reach the wounded heart, music can carry light into the darkest places. It is the one voice that never dies. Keanu sat back, the words echoing inside him. His mother had believed deeply in the power of music. She had once dreamed of him playing the piano, filling rooms with sound instead of scripts or camera flashes. But life had swept him in another direction. Acting had taken hold, and music had become a forgotten corner of his youth. Now, with her gone, the notebook felt like a message from across the distance between life and death. He closed his eyes, the memories rushing back. He could see her sitting in the living room, encouraging him as a boy to press his small fingers against the piano keys. Her voice had been warm, urging patience when he stumbled. She had believed he would one day bring life to melodies of his own, but he had let it go. Acting had demanded his time, his spirit, his years. And when she passed, that dream had seemed lost forever. Yet holding the notebook now, he felt something stir. It was not regret, though regret was part of it. It was something deeper, something more insistent. A vow began to form in him, quiet at first, then undeniable. He whispered it into the stillness of the room, a promise carried only by the lamp's glow and the silence of the night. I will honor you through music. I will give life to what you believed I could be. He knew he could not step into the shoes of a child prodigy or a master who had dedicated decades to the craft. But what he could do was embrace the dream she had carried for him, not in competition with others, but in the fulfillment of a promise. It was in that state of mind, searching for purpose, that he stumbled across something extraordinary. Among a stack of old scores, given to him by a collector friend who knew of his quiet interest in music, he found the name Silas Richter, a 19th century composer, long forgotten except in the margins of history books. One particular score had a note scribbled across its cover, unplayable. The faded manuscript smelled faintly of age, the ink on its staff lines darkened but still legible. Keanu held it carefully, his eyes scanning the clustered notes that seemed to spill across the page like a storm captured in black and white. The title written at the top in bold script read, "The Impossible Sonata." The more he studied it, the clearer it became why someone had dismissed it as unplayable. The runs were impossibly dense, passages demanding fingers to move faster than muscle and bone could allow. Some chords required spans no human hand could stretch, while others demanded speed that defied natural rhythm. It looked less like music and more like an impossible puzzle. Most would have set it aside, labeling, "Is it a curiosity of a composer who had lost his way?" But Keanu didn't close the score. He stared at it, as though it were speaking directly to him, daring him to look deeper. Richter, the forgotten composer, had not been mad. He had been ahead of his time. Keanu thought of his mother's words again, written in her notebook. Music carries light into the darkest places. What if this sonata, abandoned as unplayable, was not a failure but a voice that had never been allowed to speak? What if bringing it to life could fulfill her dream, not just by playing music, but by resurrecting something lost to history? He traced the notes with his finger, imagining the sound they might produce. It was chaotic, yes, but within the chaos there was a structure, a hidden order waiting to be unlocked. It would require discipline, patience, and something beyond conventional training. To most, it was nonsense. To him, it was a challenge, a message from the past waiting for someone willing to listen. The decision settled over him with the weight of destiny. He closed the notebook from his mother, placed it beside Richter's score, and whispered into the empty room, "If I can give this music a voice, I'll give her dream life again." From that moment, his course was set. He did not imagine himself as a prodigy returning to the stage. He did not care about proving himself to critics or peers. This was not about fame, applause, or recognition. It was about something far more intimate, the bond between a son and the mother who had believed in him. But beneath that vow was another current he could not deny. If he succeeded, if he could play what history had declared unplayable, he would not only honor her, but also challenge the guardians of tradition who claimed ownership over what could and could not be done. The thought was not prideful but purposeful. He was not coming to destroy their world, but to remind them that music was larger than rules, older than institutions, and deeper than judgment. The sonata would become his vessel. Through it, he would speak for his mother, for Richter, and perhaps for every soul who had been silenced before their song was heard. The following days became a quiet ritual. Each morning, Keanu sat at the piano, with the manuscript spread across the stand, the pages fragile but determined to be heard. He began with the first few measures, his fingers stumbling through the dense architecture of Richter's mind. The sounds were strange, dissonant, even ugly at first. Yet beneath the chaos, he sensed a heartbeat. Hours turned into nights. He would lose himself in the tangled passages until his back ached and his hands trembled. At times, frustration pushed him to the edge. He would lower his head against the keys, breathing heavily, wondering if the critics were right if some music was never meant to be played. But then he would see his mother's notebook, open beside him, her handwriting steady and graceful. Those words anchored him. Music heals. Music carries light. On evenings when exhaustion weighed him down, Daniel Harper would stop by. He had noticed the change in Keanu. The way his phone went unanswered. The way his world seemed to shrink to the size of 88 keys. Daniel would lean against the doorframe, listening quietly before speaking. "You're chasing a ghost," he'd say, his voice half worried, half admiring. "Not a ghost," Keanu would reply without looking up. "A voice that hasn't spoken yet." Daniel would watch the determination in his friend's face, the discipline that bordered on obsession. It reminded him of the fire he had once felt in his own youth, before fate had silenced his hands. He knew the risks, the toll it could take, but he also understood the necessity of it. Some promises had to be pursued, even if the world called them foolish. Weeks passed, and small victories emerged. A run that once felt impossible became smoother under his fingers. A chord that had seemed unplayable revealed a hidden fingering, a stretch achieved by rethinking his approach. Slowly, the chaos began to align. The sonata revealed fragments of its beauty, glimmers of a melody that shimmered through the storm. It was in those fragile breakthroughs that Keanu felt closest to his mother. Each note mastered was like a conversation renewed, a bridge between the past and the present. In the stillness of his home, with no audience but the memory of her voice, he felt her presence urging him on. And yet, beneath the intimacy of that vow, another truth sharpened. He knew that one day he would have to step onto a stage, not just to fulfill a promise to himself, but to show the world that some dreams cannot be dismissed as impossible. The critics would laugh, the maestros would sneer, but when the moment came, he would not be playing for them, he would be playing for her. He looked down at the manuscript one final time that night, the lamp flickering over the ink. His fingers rested on the opening chord. He whispered to the empty room, "This is where it begins." The first step Keanu took after discovering the impossible sonata was to seek guidance. He knew he could not do this alone. Though his determination was unshakable, he was also painfully aware of his shortcomings. His fingers lacked the polish of lifelong training. His posture was rigid, his phrasing uncertain. If he wanted to give this forgotten masterpiece life, he would need help from someone who understood the language of classical piano at its deepest level. It was Daniel who first suggested Mrs. Anna Petrova. Her name carried weight in every conservatory from Moscow to New York. Once a prodigy herself, she had spent decades shaping raw talent into disciplined performers. She was known for her severity, her insistence on precision, and her unrelenting focus on the heart of the music. "If anyone can help you," Daniel had said, "it's her. But be warned, she takes no prisoners." Their first meeting took place in a studio lined with shelves of sheet music and faded portraits of the great composers. Mrs. Petrova entered with the authority of a general, her hair pulled into a severe bun, her eyes sharp and unyielding. She studied Keanu with a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. "You are an actor," she said flatly. "Why do you want to play piano?" Keanu hesitated, then answered simply, "Because some voices shouldn't stay silent. I want to learn." Her gaze lingered on him for a moment, weighing the sincerity of his words. Finally, she nodded toward the piano. "Sit. Play for me." Keanu positioned himself carefully, opened to the first page of the sonata, and began. His fingers struck the keys with measured accuracy. Each note landed in its place. The rhythm steady. The sound technically correct. Yet, as the melody unfolded, Mrs. Petrova's expression grew darker. When he stopped, she rapped a pencil sharply on the lid of the piano. "No, no, no," she scolded, her accent thick, her voice cutting. "This is not music. This is machine. You play like a robot. No heart, no breath, no soul." Her words stung, but Keanu forced himself to stay calm. "I can get better," he said quietly. She narrowed her eyes. "We will see." But remember, piano is not mathematics. It is not a film script. It is blood and spirit. Without that, you will fail. So began weeks of grueling lessons. Every morning, Keanu arrived at her studio, his shoulders squared, his eyes focused. She drilled him on scales until his hands cramped, corrected his posture until his back ached, and demanded he play the same passage again and again until sweat dripped from his brow. But no matter how hard he tried, she always found fault. His phrasing was too rigid, his dynamics too flat, his timing too exact. To her, he sounded like someone repeating words in a language he did not truly speak. Each session ended the same way, with her sighing in frustration. "You have discipline, yes," she admitted one afternoon, pacing the room. "But discipline is not enough. You cannot force music to appear. You must feel it, let it breathe. And you, Mr. Reeves, You do not breathe. You recite. Her words echoed in his mind long after he left. He wanted to argue, to insist that he did feel the music, but deep down he knew she was right. Something vital was missing. He had technique, he had focus, but the soul of the piece still eluded him. The lessons grew harsher with time. Mrs. Petrova was not a woman who softened her critiques. If anything, she grew more direct as the weeks passed. She struck the air with her pencil like a conductor's baton, barking orders in clipped phrases. Too stiff, too shallow, again. Her standards were merciless, and though Keanu absorbed every word, his progress was slow, halting, unsatisfying. For a man who had mastered the art of discipline through decades of acting, the piano was a humbling battlefield. On film sets, he could rehearse a scene 100 times until it felt alive. He could bend himself into a role with patience and commitment. But here, no matter how many hours he practiced, the music resisted him. His notes were clean but lifeless, his timing impeccable but hollow. One evening, after another grueling session, he remained at the piano long after Mrs. Petrova had left. His hands hovered over the keys, trembling with fatigue. The studio was silent, except for the faint ticking of a clock on the wall. He pressed a chord, then another, but even alone, the sound mocked him. He felt like a child fumbling through a language that refused to take root in his soul. The following day, Petrova lost her patience. He was attempting a passage from Chopin, his brow furrowed in concentration. The notes rang out crisp and cold, as if carved from stone. Abruptly, she slammed her hand down on the lid, making him jump. "Stop!" she commanded. "I cannot listen to this any longer." Keanu sat frozen, his fingers still resting on the keys. "You are not a pianist," she said, her voice sharp with finality. "You are an imitator. Music cannot be built from willpower alone. It must come from within. And you are too stiff, too late. You cannot learn this." The words cut deeper than any review or rejection he had faced in Hollywood. He lowered his eyes, the weight of her judgment pressing on him. She gathered her coat, her footsteps firm as she walked toward the door. Before leaving, she looked back once more. "You are a good man," she said, softer now, almost regretful. "But you do not have music in your soul. Find peace elsewhere." Then she was gone. The silence that followed was suffocating. For the first time since beginning this journey, doubt consumed him fully. He leaned back on the bench, his chest heavy, his hands limp in his lap. Maybe she was right. Maybe the sonata was beyond him. Maybe his mother's dream was destined to remain unfulfilled. And yet, as he sat in that quiet studio, his gaze fell on the notebook he carried everywhere. Its worn cover held the words that had anchored him before. "Don't fear failure. It's where the soul is found." His mother's voice echoed in his memory, steady and gentle. Failure. That was what this was. But maybe failure was not the end. Maybe it was the beginning of something different. Keanu stayed in the studio long after Petrova's departure. The piano sat before him, no longer an adversary but a mirror reflecting his struggle. He touched the keys lightly, pressing a single note and letting it fade into silence. The sound was simple, imperfect, yet it carried more weight than all the mechanical perfection he had produced in weeks of training. He realized that his tutor's words, harsh as they were, had stripped away his illusions. He could not become a pianist in the traditional sense, molded by years of conservatory drills. But perhaps that wasn't what he was meant to be. That night, he walked home under the city's dim glow, his mother's notebook clutched against his chest. Each step felt heavy, but inside the heaviness was a small flicker of clarity. She had never demanded perfection from him. She had wanted him to feel music, to let it live in him. And she had left him with the belief that failure was not shameful but essential, the place where the soul is uncovered. Sitting alone in his apartment, he opened the notebook once more. Her handwriting sprawled across the page, calm and elegant. "Don't fear failure. It's where the soul is found." He read it again and again, the words burrowing deeper until they became his own. If Petrova believed he was too late, then so be it. He would not follow the rigid path she demanded. He would carve another. He would learn not by imitating the masters, but by discovering what the music meant to him. He would train not to please critics, but to keep a promise to the woman who believed in him long before the world ever did. The next morning, his routine changed. He no longer timed his scales against a metronome or measured every phrase against textbooks. Instead, he played slowly, listening for the pulse beneath each note. He practiced fragments of the impossible sonata not for accuracy alone, but for feeling, letting mistakes guide him to new possibilities. Sometimes the music broke apart in his hands, collapsing into chaos. Other times, a fleeting moment of beauty would shine through, raw and unrefined, but alive. Daniel visited again and noticed the shift. He listened as Keanu stumbled through a passage, wrong notes scattered like debris. Yet there was something different, an honesty that had been absent before. When the final chord faded, Daniel nodded slowly. "It isn't perfect," he said, "but it's real." Keanu allowed himself a faint smile. For the first time in weeks, he felt hope. He knew the road ahead would be longer, lonelier, and harder without the guidance of tradition. But he also knew that the impossible sonata did not ask for tradition. It asked for courage. He closed his mother's notebook gently, setting it on the piano where it would remain. It was no longer just a relic of memory, it was his compass. The failed lessons had not ended his journey. They had begun it anew. After Petrova's departure, Keanu knew he had to create a new approach. The traditional doors were closed to him, but his vow remained. He would not abandon the impossible sonata. If the established path had failed, then he would build one of his own. Daniel saw this determination in his eyes and understood that nothing would stop him now. So he offered what he could support, guidance, and the tools of a different era. They transformed a spare warehouse near the edge of the city into a private studio. Its concrete walls were bare, its windows covered to keep out distraction. Inside, they constructed an environment that felt both austere and alive with possibility. Cameras were mounted at every angle around the piano, recording every movement of Keanu's hands, sensitive. Microphones captured the slightest nuance of sound. A set of small sensors was fitted to his wrists and shoulders, measuring posture and pressure. Daniel explained the setup like a director describing a stage. "This isn't about turning you into a machine," he said. "It's about showing you what you can't see. Think of it as watching dailies on a film set. Every detail matters, and every mistake can teach you something." Keanu embraced the idea. It was familiar, almost comforting. As an actor, he had spent years analyzing footage of his performances, watching not for vanity, but for truth. He would study the tilt of his head, the timing of a pause, the flicker of an expression. Now he applied the same discipline to music. Each day he played passages of the sonata while the cameras rolled, and each night he sat with Daniel reviewing the recordings. "Here," Daniel would point, slowing the footage to reveal a tiny hesitation in his left hand. "Your breath stopped right before that note. You tightened. The sound reflects it." Keanu would nod, watching himself with the same detached eye he once reserved for film scenes. He began to notice the connections between body, breath, and tone. When he held his breath, the music stalled. When his shoulders tensed, the rhythm stiffened. But when he allowed himself to breathe steadily, when he relaxed into the keys, the notes began to flow with unexpected ease. The sensors confirmed what his body was learning. Graphs displayed on a nearby screen revealed the subtle patterns of tension and release. Keanu studied them with quiet fascination, not as cold data, but as signs of growth. He was not seeking perfection in numbers alone. He was seeking alignment between the technical and the emotional, the physical and the spiritual. Night after night, he repeated the cycle. Play, record, review, reflect. Slowly, something shifted. The stiffness that once defined his playing began to dissolve. His fingers moved with more natural grace. His phrasing carried more breath, more life. For the first time, when he struck a chord, it lingered with warmth instead of emptiness. Daniel noticed the change first. One evening, as Keanu replayed a passage he had struggled with for weeks, the sound was different. It wasn't just correct, it was alive. The melody rose and fell with a subtle arc, carrying a weight of emotion that hadn't been there before. Daniel leaned back in his chair, arms folded, listening in silence until the final note faded. "That," he said softly, "sounded like you." Keanu sat still, his fingers resting lightly on the keys. He wasn't sure what Daniel meant at first, but then he realized. For weeks he had been trying to play like Richter, like Chopin, like anyone but himself. But this time, the music had carried something of his own voice. He had not forced it. It had come from allowing himself to be part of the sound, not apart from it. From that night onward, he treated the piano as both teacher and partner. He no longer judged every mistake as failure. Instead, he studied them like an actor watching an outtake. Each wrong note told him something about his body, his breath, his focus. He replayed the recordings, not to punish himself, but to search for honesty. The discipline that once crushed him now became a tool of discovery. The impossible sonata remained a mountain, its pages dense, with passages that defied reason. There were stretches where his hands seemed too small, rhythms that twisted like knots, chords that felt impossible to voice. But instead of recoiling from the difficulty, Keanu began to approach each measure as if it were a scene in a film. He broke it down, asked questions, searched for meaning. What emotion was hidden in this sequence? What was Richter trying to express when he wrote these cascading notes that seemed to claw toward the heavens? Daniel watched him work, amazed at the patience he brought to the process. "You treat this sonata like a role," he observed one afternoon. Keanu nodded. "That's how I understand the world. A role isn't about pretending, it's about finding truth. If I can find the truth in these notes, then I can play them." Day by day, that truth revealed itself. The cameras caught the gradual loosening of his shoulders, the increasing fluidity of his hands. The microphones captured the warmth that seeped into his tone, the way the sonata began to breathe. It was still rough, still fragile, but it was no longer lifeless. The music had begun to carry the weight of memory, grief, and love. Late at night, when exhaustion pressed heavily on him, he would close his eyes and imagine his mother sitting nearby, listening. He played not for critics or judges, but for her. Every chord was a conversation, every melody a memory-given voice. And in those moments, the impossible sonata no longer felt impossible. It felt necessary. Weeks turned into months, and the transformation deepened. The studio that once echoed with sterile scales now resonated with passages of staggering beauty and raw imperfection intertwined. Keanu had learned to embrace both. He no longer winced at a slip of the finger or a faltering rhythm. Instead, he leaned into them, knowing that humanity lived inside those flaws. Just as in film, where the unscripted moments often became the most powerful, so too in music did the unpolished notes reveal hidden emotion. Daniel often sat quietly in the corner, marveling at how far Keanu had come. At first, his friend's playing had been rigid, cold, like a statue trying to speak. Now, even when he stumbled, the piano seemed to sigh, weep, or laugh with him. The impossible sonata, once a fortress of ink on paper, was slowly bending under the weight of Keanu's persistence. The technical hurdles that had mocked him before were yielding step by patient step. Keanu's method was unlike anything a conservatory would teach. He approached each movement as if it were a scene in a story. He studied the score not just as notes, but as dialogue. The rushing scales became cries of desperation. The heavy chords thundered like conflict. The fleeting, fragile melodies whispered like memories half remembered. He recorded these attempts, watched them back, and adjusted as though refining a performance for the screen. Every gesture, every pause, every breath mattered. In time, the cameras captured something extraordinary. His body began to move with the music, in ways it hadn't before. Not exaggerated, not theatrical, but natural. His breath aligned with the rise and fall of the phrases. His fingers, once tense, now curved with quiet confidence, finding their place on the keys like footsteps on familiar ground. The sensors showed smoother patterns of tension and release, his posture more relaxed, his rhythm steadier yet freer. But beyond the mechanics, the sound itself changed. The sonata no longer sounded like a puzzle being solved. It sounded like a story being told. Each night, Daniel left the studio shaken, unable to put into words what he had heard. He knew it wasn't perfect by academic standards, but it carried something deeper, an emotional gravity that couldn't be faked. Keanu often finished practice by sitting in silence, hands folded, eyes closed. In those quiet moments, he imagined Richter himself listening. He wondered if the composer, dismissed as a madman in his own time, had dreamed of someone one day finding a way to give his music voice. Perhaps this was why the score had survived, why it had found its way into Keanu's hands. The impossible sonata was still a battlefield, but for the first time, Keanu felt he belonged on it. He was not just fighting the piece, he was conversing with it, learning from it, and slowly shaping it into something alive. And as he closed the notebook each night, he whispered the same vow: this music will not remain silent. The more Keanu pushed forward, the heavier the toll became. Hours at the piano stretched into long nights, and long nights into weary mornings. His fingers began to show the punishment first. The skin at his tips grew raw, sometimes splitting, until faint lines of blood marked the ivory keys. He kept a small cloth nearby to wipe them clean, but he refused to stop. The pain was sharp, but it reminded him that progress was being carved into his body. His wrists and forearms stiffened from the relentless practice. Cramps seized his hands without warning, forcing him to stretch them slowly before resuming. There were nights when he left the studio unable to uncurl his fingers, each joint aching as if he had been in battle. Daniel urged him to rest more, but Keanu only shook his head. "If I stop now," he said quietly, "the mountain will only grow taller." Yet the physical toll was only half the weight he carried. The emotional strain cut deeper. Every note he played pulled memories of his mother closer. He would picture her sitting beside him, as she once did when he was young, her hand resting lightly on his shoulder, her smile encouraging him forward. But those images always gave way to the grief of her absence, and sometimes the guilt that he had waited too long to honor her dream. In moments of exhaustion, the doubts returned. He questioned whether he had the right to attempt a piece even the greatest pianists had abandoned. He wondered if all he was doing was chasing an illusion, trying to rewrite time with music that was destined to remain silent. Those thoughts gnawed at him, especially when fatigue clouded his judgment and the piano sounded less like a friend and more like an accuser. Daniel saw the signs. He watched Keanu's shoulders slump, his eyes shadowed, his movements slower. One evening, after Keanu stumbled through a passage and dropped his hands in frustration, Daniel stepped forward. He rested a hand on his friend's back and said firmly, "Keanu, you've always lived for others. You've carried the weight of fans, of friends, of family. But this can't be for them. It has to be for you and for her." The words sank into the silence. Keanu lifted his head, meeting Daniel's gaze. He realized that in his quest to fulfill a promise, he had overlooked the truth his mother hadn't wanted perfection. She had wanted him to play because she believed music could bring him life. The promise wasn't about proving himself to the world, but about giving himself to the music without fear. Keanu nodded slowly, his breath steadying. He set his fingers on the keys again, not with the stiffness of obligation, but with the openness of vulnerability. The notes that followed were imperfect, trembling, but they carried the rawness of his heart. And for the first time in days, the studio felt less like a battlefield and more like a sanctuary. The weeks that followed were the hardest yet, but also the most transformative. Keanu's body bore the signs of strain-bandaged fingertips, swollen knuckles, stiff muscles, but his spirit carried something new. He no longer approached the piano as if it were a test to pass. He approached it like a confession, every note an admission of pain, love, regret, and hope. Some nights, the fatigue nearly overcame him. His vision blurred from sleeplessness, his shoulders burned from the hours spent hunched over the keys. More than once, he fell asleep right at the bench, his hands still resting on the piano, his head bowed as if in prayer. Daniel often found him like this, covered him with a blanket, and let him rest. But even then, Keanu would wake before dawn, stretch his stiff hands, and begin again. The impossible sonata began to reveal itself differently now. Before, it had been a fortress, each page a wall that mocked him with its complexity. But as his playing grew more vulnerable, the walls seemed to shift, allowing him glimpses inside. What had once felt like chaos began to show patterns, passages of yearning, waves of sorrow, bursts of triumph. He no longer saw the sonata as an enemy to conquer, but as a partner demanding honesty. One evening, as he played through a particularly brutal section, his fingers faltered and the notes clashed into dissonance. Frustrated, he stopped and pressed his palms to his eyes. Daniel, who had been sitting nearby, spoke softly. "Keanu, you're carrying every mistake like a chain around your neck. Let them go. The audience won't remember wrong notes, they'll remember if you made them feel something." Keanu lowered his hands, breathing deeply. He thought about the films he had made, the roles where the most powerful moments were never scripted, where a stumble or a pause had revealed more truth than polished delivery. Music, he realized, was no different. The cracks were not weaknesses. They were entry points for the soul. The next time he played, he allowed the mistakes to stay. His fingers slipped once, then recovered, but instead of shame, he felt a strange freedom. The imperfection carried weight, like a scar that told a story. For the first time, he felt the sonata breathing with him, moving not as a flawless machine, but as a living, fragile thing. Daniel's eyes glistened as he listened. "That's it," he whispered, barely audible. "That's what was missing." From then on, Keanu pushed himself with a new sense of purpose. The pain in his body was no longer just suffering. It was a reminder that he was alive, that he was giving everything he had. Each note became an act of devotion, not only to his mother's memory, but to himself. The journey reached its most grueling stage, when both body and spirit threatened to give out. The skin on Keanu's fingers had hardened into calluses, but even those split under the constant demand of the sonata. He taped them, but the bandages frayed as quickly as he replaced them. Every note pressed was a mixture of sound, sting, yet he pressed on. There were moments when despair whispered to him. Late at night, sitting alone at the piano, he would feel the weight of lost years pressing down. He thought of the time when his mother had been alive, when he might have sat beside her and learned more simply, without the burden of grief. That regret gnawed at him, and sometimes he lowered his head and wondered if he was chasing a dream too late to matter. But then Daniel's words would echo in his memory. "Play for yourself and for her." Those words reshaped the silence around him. He realized that guilt over the past could not be the force driving him. The music had to come from love, not remorse. His mother's dream was not about him living in sorrow, but about him living fully. So he rededicated himself with a deeper resolve. He began each session not by drilling the sonata's impossible passages, but by closing his eyes and breathing slowly, allowing himself to feel. He imagined walking into a scene on set, not to perform a line, but to live inside it. When he touched the keys, he let his breath guide the rhythm. His heart set the tone. Discipline and vulnerability began to merge, no longer at odds but intertwined. The change was undeniable. His playing grew in richness, even when fatigue made his hands clumsy. The sonata was no longer just a technical exercise. It became a vessel carrying memory, grief, and hope. Every phrase seemed to speak not only of Richter's vision, but of Keanu's own life. The struggles, the losses, the resilience that had carried him this far. One night, as he reached the end of a long passage, his hands trembling, he struck the final chord and let it linger. The sound filled the room, raw and imperfect, yet charged with something unexplainable. Daniel, seated quietly nearby, whispered. "That's music." Keanu lifted his gaze, sweat glistening on his brow, chest heaving. For the first time, he allowed himself a small smile. He had not conquered the sonata, not yet, but he had begun to merge the two halves of himself, the disciplined craftsman and the vulnerable son. And in that union, he sensed the truth of what his mother had written long ago. The soul is found in failure and in the courage to rise again. The day of the next round arrived with a tension that hung in the air like storm clouds. The grand hall glittered with chandeliers, its marble floors reflecting the nervous pacing of contestants in pressed suits and gowns. Reporters clustered near the entryways, cameras ready, pens scratching across notebooks. Every movement, every whispered word was being watched, weighed, and judged. Keanu walked through the corridor with quiet composure. His black suit was simple, his footsteps measured, his gaze steady. While others adjusted cuffs or muttered fragments of scales under their breath, he seemed almost detached, as though the chaos around him existed in another world. Yet inside, his body carried the memory of countless hours at the piano, the rawness of sleepless nights, the aches that still pulsed through his fingers. He knew he was ready, but readiness did not erase the gravity of where he stood. It was there, in the shadow of a gilded doorway, that Maestro Viktor Armand appeared. The great pianist's presence commanded attention before he spoke a word. His posture was regal, his expression carved in disdain, as if he had been waiting for this moment. With slow precision, he stepped into Keanu's path, forcing him to stop. The hallway seemed to narrow around them. "You insult this hall by being here," Viktor said, his voice sharp enough to cut the hush of conversation. His words carried, ensuring that every reporter, every contestant nearby heard them. "You play without soul. You are a disgrace." The air thickened instantly. Heads turned, whispers rippled, and eyes gleamed with the thrill of spectacle. Some of the younger contestants stifled smirks, while the press leaned forward, their pens eager. Here was drama, the kind that made headlines. The maestro himself, a guardian of tradition, publicly tearing down the outsider who dared to tread on sacred ground. Keanu did not flinch. He stood with the same stillness he had carried onto film sets, under hot lights and watchful cameras. He met Viktor's gaze without anger, his expression calm, almost unreadable. The silence stretched, heavy with expectation. "You see arrogance in me," Keanu said softly, his voice even and measured. "But you've only seen the first act, Maestro. Wait for the finale." A murmur rolled through the hallway like a wave. Some gasped, others chuckled nervously, unsure if his words were bravery or folly. Viktor's jaw tightened. For the briefest flicker of a moment, something shifted in his eyes, an unease he quickly masked with arrogance. "Finale?" Viktor scoffed, raising his chin. "There will be no finale. You will not survive long enough to see one." His voice carried confidence, but the steadiness of Keanu's reply had unsettled him. It was not the defiance of a fool, but the composure of someone who carried a secret yet to be revealed. Keanu gave no further explanation. He inclined his head slightly, an acknowledgement rather than submission, and stepped past Viktor with quiet dignity. The crowd parted to let him through, their whispers following him down the hall. Some saw a man doomed to failure. Others sensed a storm still waiting to break. Behind him, Viktor remained rooted in place. His smirk returned, but it did not reach his eyes. For the first time in decades, he felt the faint tremor of uncertainty, a crack in the fortress of his pride. The murmur of the confrontation spread quickly through the hall like fire through dry grass. Within minutes, contestants gathered in clusters, whispering and chuckling, their voices pitched just loud enough for Keanu to overhear as he walked away. "A Hollywood clown," one muttered. "He thinks this is a movie set." Another laughed. Their words carried the cruelty of envy and the relief of knowing the ridicule was not directed at them. The reporters wasted no time. Pens scratched furiously across notepads, their faces lit with the satisfaction of having caught conflict worth printing. Some whispered to each other, planning headlines that would pit the mighty maestro against the quiet actor, a battle of art and arrogance. They smelled blood, and they followed it with practiced instinct. Viktor lingered in the corridor, basking in the moment. To the crowd, his laughter and disdain appeared unshakable, the confidence of a man untouchable in his kingdom. But behind the mask, the memory of Keanu's calm words lingered like a dissonant chord that refused to resolve. "Wait for the finale." The phrase gnawed at him, quiet but insistent. He told himself it was arrogance, nothing more than bravado. Yet the steadiness in Keanu's tone unsettled him. There had been no quiver of nerves, no flash of desperation. Instead, it was spoken with a weight that felt too deliberate, too certain. Meanwhile, Keanu stepped into a smaller side hallway, away from the crowd, and exhaled. He was not shaken by Viktor's words, at least, not outwardly. He had endured criticism before, endured humiliation on sets when critics doubted his abilities, endured grief far deeper than the sting of mockery. Still, the sting lingered, not because of Viktor's disdain, but because the maestro's words echoed the doubts that already haunted him. "You play without soul." He knew he was still building, still discovering. The wounds of his failed lessons with Petrova had not entirely healed, and moments like this threatened to reopen them. It was Daniel who found him leaning quietly against the wall, his gaze lowered. "I heard," Daniel said gently. "He wanted a spectacle, and he got one. But Keanu, you gave him something he didn't expect." Keanu lifted his eyes. "What's that?" "Calm," Daniel replied. "You didn't bite, you didn't bow. You reminded him that you're not finished. And believe me, that unsettled him more than any argument would." Keanu managed a faint smile, though his chest still carried the heaviness of the exchange. "I wasn't speaking for him. I was speaking for myself." Daniel nodded. "Then hold on to that, because when the finale comes, you're not just proving him wrong. You're proving to yourself that you've carried this sonata further than anyone believed possible." Keanu straightened, rolling his shoulders as though shedding the weight of the confrontation. The echoes of laughter and whispers from the hallway were still there, but they no longer pressed on him. He knew who he was playing for, and it was not them. Back in the main corridor, Viktor adjusted his cufflinks and smirked at the reporters who crowded him with questions. He offered sharp sound bites, dismissals laced with superiority. "Art is sacrifice," he declared. "It cannot be borrowed, cannot be faked. Some people will learn that the hard way." The words drew nods from the crowd, but even as he spoke them, the echo of Keanu's calm challenge refused to leave his thoughts. And so, though the maestro wore his arrogance like armor, a faint unease began to creep beneath it. For the first time in years, he felt the presence of a rival not in skill, but in conviction. The days leading up to the finals carried a strange tension in the city. The competition hall buzzed with endless rehearsals. Contestants buried themselves in practice rooms, their fingers racing across keys in frantic preparation. Some shouted at assistants, others sweated through scales until their bodies shook. The air outside the hall was thick with rivalry and nerves, but Keanu was nowhere to be found there. While others fought for every ounce of rehearsal time under the chandeliered ceilings, he had disappeared into the warehouse studio Daniel had built with him months earlier. It was dim, plain, stripped of grandeur, but it was his sanctuary. Here, the noise of ambition and scorn did not exist. Here, only the piano spoke. Keanu arrived each morning before sunrise. The warehouse echoed with his footsteps, a hollow sound that vanished once the first notes filled the air. Daniel was always nearby, adjusting the cameras, watching in silence. This was no longer about documenting flaws. It was about capturing transformation. Keanu's fingers moved faster now, shaped by countless hours of toil. The impossible sonata had ceased to be an enemy. It was still brutal. Its passages still pushed him to his limits, but his body no longer recoiled at its difficulty. His hands, hardened and scarred, found their place more naturally. Where once he had stumbled, he now glided. Where once his breath faltered, it flowed with the rhythm of the music. Yet what struck Daniel most was not the speed, not even the accuracy. It was the expression that poured from Keanu's playing. Each phrase seemed to carry a weight, a meaning beyond the notes themselves. Daniel listened one evening, leaning against the wall, and realized that Keanu was no longer just practicing. He was performing, even if no audience was there to hear. "Do you know what you're doing?" Daniel asked after one particularly moving passage. Keanu looked up, sweat shining on his brow. "What do you mean?" "You're not playing music anymore," Daniel said. "You're telling a story. Every note is like a line of dialogue. You're acting, but without words." Keanu's gaze softened. He hadn't thought of it that way, but it was true. Acting had always been about truth, about inhabiting a character so fully that the audience forgot the performance. Now he realized he was doing the same through music. He wasn't trying to imitate Richter or satisfy the critics. He was speaking through the piano as if it were his voice, unfiltered and raw. Night after night, the pattern repeated. Hours of immersion, notes tumbling like rivers, crescendos breaking like storms, quiet passages whispering like confessions. When fatigue finally forced him to stop, Keanu would sit at the bench in silence, staring at the worn photograph of his mother that he kept nearby. He would place it gently on the piano, trace the edges with his fingers, and whisper, "Tomorrow, I'll give them your song." The finals crept closer with each passing day, but in the warehouse, time seemed suspended. Keanu lost himself in the rhythm of repetition, the rise and fall of melodies that grew more alive each night. He no longer counted hours or measured progress by flawless runs. Instead, he measured it by honesty, by whether the sonata sounded like truth. Daniel noticed the subtle changes first. Keanu's posture had softened, his movements no longer rigid with tension. His head tilted slightly as he played, as if listening to a voice only he could hear. His shoulders rose and fell in time with the music. Not exaggerated, but natural, the way a man breathes when telling a story close to his heart. The cameras caught it, all the trembling hands, the furrowed brows, the moments when a single chord seemed to weigh heavier than an entire movement. Sometimes Daniel would ask him to stop, to rest, but Keanu only shook his head. "Every night matters," he said. "If I don't give everything here, I won't have it when it counts." Daniel didn't argue. He knew Keanu wasn't chasing victory anymore. He was chasing something deeper, something that could not be measured by judges or applause. It was the moment he would stand before the world and let the music carry his mother's dream into the light. As the nights grew colder, the warehouse took on a kind of sacred atmosphere. The walls, bare and unadorned, seemed to lean closer, holding the sound of each rehearsal like memory etched into stone. When Keanu struck a chord, the resonance lingered long after his fingers lifted, as though the building itself understood the weight of his purpose. On one particular evening, fatigue nearly overwhelmed him. His fingers trembled, the notes of the sonata blurring under the weight of exhaustion. He dropped his hands, leaned forward, and pressed his forehead against the cool wood of the piano. For a moment, it felt as if the dream was slipping away, as if all the sacrifice would collapse under its own strain. Daniel walked over, resting a hand on his shoulder. "Keanu, you've already gone further than anyone thought you could. Don't measure yourself against them. Measure yourself against the promise you made." Keanu lifted his head slowly, his eyes burning with quiet determination. "That's exactly why I can't stop. She believed I had something inside me worth giving. Tomorrow, I need to prove her right." He returned to the keys with renewed focus. This time, the music flowed differently, less strained, less burdened. Each note rose like breath, carried not by will alone, but by surrender. He let the sonata speak for itself, and in that surrender, he found freedom. When the final chord of the night echoed into silence, Keanu sat back, drenched in sweat, chest heaving. He reached for the photograph of his mother, the edges worn from countless touches. Holding it gently, he whispered again, "Tomorrow, I'll give them your song." His voice was low, steady, and filled with reverence. Daniel turned off the cameras, but the moment did not need recording. It was etched already in Keanu's hands, in his heart, and in the music that would soon face the world. The morning of the finals dawned gray and heavy, as if the sky itself carried the weight of anticipation. Outside the concert hall, a sea of people gathered, their breath forming mist in the cool air. Cameramen positioned themselves for the best shots. Journalists rehearsed their introductions, and ticket holders clutched programs with trembling hands. This was not just another round of a competition. It was the culmination of everything. The night when reputations would be made or destroyed. Inside, the hall shimmered with brilliance. Crystal chandeliers glowed overhead, casting light across velvet seats and polished marble floors. The audience filled every row, their voices merging into a low, restless hum. Whispers spread like sparks. Talk of the contestants who had already established themselves as prodigies, the critics who would carve their names into tomorrow's reviews, the maestro who still reigned over them all. The tension was electric, humming beneath the grandeur. One by one, the contestants before Keanu delivered performances that dazzled the crowd. A young woman from Vienna poured her soul into a Rachmaninoff prelude, her fingers flying with fire. A prodigy from Tokyo played Chopin with such tenderness that several in the audience wiped away tears. Each performance seemed to raise the bar higher, each one a reminder of how unforgiving this stage could be. The applause thundered after every final chord, echoing like judgment waiting for the next in line. From his seat among the judges, Maestro Viktor Armand sat with regal composure, his eyes sharp and unyielding. He leaned forward during the performances, listening with both criticism and satisfaction. He admired the artistry, the discipline, the fire. But more than that, he savored the anticipation of what was coming. For he knew who remained. He knew that when Keanu Reeves stepped onto that stage, the contrast would be devastating. In his mind, it was not a question of if Keanu would collapse, but how spectacularly. As the final intermission approached, the atmosphere thickened. Even those who had cheered for the earlier contestants leaned forward with curiosity. They had read the headlines, seen the whispers on social pages, heard the mocking remarks of the critics. Tonight, they would finally see the actor who dared to sit among musicians. For many, it was entertainment more than expectation. A sideshow, a story to tell later about how a Hollywood figure stumbled where only masters could stand. Backstage, Keanu waited in silence. His plain suit contrasted with the elaborate gowns and tailored coats of the other contestants. He sat with his hands folded, his breathing slow, his eyes steady. The photograph of his mother rested inside his jacket pocket, close to his heart. He could hear the applause fading for the contestant before him, the waves of clapping rolling like distant thunder. Daniel stood nearby, watching his friend with quiet intensity. He had no words left to give, no instructions or encouragement. Keanu was beyond advice now. He had entered a place of calm that only those who had already fought their hardest battles could know. When the announcer's voice rang out at last, "Our next performer, Mr. Keanu Reeves," the air in the hall shifted instantly. A murmur spread through the audience, a mixture of laughter, curiosity, and disbelief. Reporters lifted their pens, photographers angled their lenses. The crowd leaned forward, eager for the spectacle. For them, this was the moment they had been waiting for, not to witness brilliance, but to witness failure. The hall grew still as Keanu stepped onto the stage. His stride was measured, his head slightly bowed, his presence free of grandeur. He wore no flashy attire, carried no aura of theatrical performance. To many, this only confirmed what they believed, that he did not belong. A ripple of chuckles moved across the seats, hushed quickly by the weight of the setting, but the smirks lingered. Victor leaned back in his chair, lips curling into the faintest smile. He folded his arms, already tasting the satisfaction of vindication. Around him, the other judges exchanged knowing glances, their pens poised not to capture artistry, but to record failure. Keanu reached the bench and paused. He bowed his head slightly toward the judges and the audience, a gesture of respect rather than performance. Then, he Saturday. The silence deepened, broken only by the faint shuffle of papers in the critic's hands. For a long moment, Keanu rested his fingers on the keys without playing. The hall waited, growing restless. Some whispered, others smirked, but still he did not move. Instead, he closed his eyes and drew a slow breath, steadying himself not against them, but for himself. Inside, he felt the worn photograph against his chest, the memory of nights spent in the warehouse, the sound of Daniel's voice urging him forward, and above all, the echo of his mother's words. When his hands finally moved, it was not with the fire of the prodigies who had come before, but with quiet intention. The first notes fell into the silence like drops of water into stillness, measured, unhurried, almost fragile. The audience leaned forward, their anticipation shifting into curiosity. It was not dazzling, not yet, but it was not lifeless either. There was a weight to the sound, a voice within it. From the judge's table, Viktor narrowed his eyes. He had expected stiffness, arrogance, disguised as art. Instead, he heard something he had not anticipated: restraint. It unsettled him, though he would never admit it. The murmurs in the audience died away as the melody unfolded. Those who had expected failure began to listen more closely, drawn by the subtle force of the notes. Keanu's face remained calm, his eyes closed, as though he was somewhere else entirely, somewhere beyond the hall and its judgment. Each phrase carried with it the shadow of nights spent in solitude, the ache of exhaustion, the memory of promises whispered into the dark. The crowd did not know yet what they were witnessing. Many still believed he would stumble, that the facade would crumble, but something unexplainable hung in the air, a tension not born of mockery, but of suspense. And when Keanu lifted his hands for the first pause, letting silence settle like a held breath, the hall itself seemed to lean toward him. Even those who had come expecting failure now felt it. Something was happening here, something none of them had prepared for. The murmur of the hall shifted as stagehands wheeled in a piano, unlike the gleaming Steinways the contestants had used before. It was familiar in form, but its finish bore a subtler sheen, its frame reinforced with modern steel supports hidden beneath polished wood. Keanu had overseen every detail, spending his own resources to ensure it could withstand the punishing demands of Richter's impossible sonata. To the untrained eye, it looked ordinary, but to those who noticed, its presence raised questions. "What is this?" someone in the front row whispered. The words spread like ripples, confusion twisting into ridicule. Critics scribbled furiously, eager to note yet another eccentricity of the actor-turned-pianist. At the judge's table, Viktor leaned forward, his lips curling into disdain. "A toy," he said under his breath, loud enough for Madame Dubois beside him to hear. She raised an eyebrow but said nothing, her gaze sharp and unyielding. Keanu walked calmly to the bench, bowed with the same quiet humility as before. And Saturday, his fingers hovered above the keys, but he did not begin. Instead, he closed his eyes and allowed silence to fill the hall. 10 seconds passed, long enough for restlessness to stir in the crowd. Murmurs rose again, impatient and mocking. To them, it looked like hesitation, proof that he was unprepared. But Keanu remained still, drawing in slow, steady breaths. He was not waiting for approval. He was centering himself, aligning his heart with the memory that had brought him here. Finally, his hands descended. The first notes exploded into the hall with a jarring dissonance. They clashed like colliding storms, wild, unrestrained, almost violent. The chords seemed to tumble over one another in chaos, breaking every expectation of beauty the audience had carried into the hall. Gasps filled the air. Some frowned, others laughed outright. A woman in the balcony muttered, "He's butchering it already." The confusion grew louder with every bar. The sonata did not ease into melody. It confronted the listeners, demanding endurance rather than admiration. The notes swarmed, unpredictable and unrelenting, like Richter had carved madness into the very fabric of the score. Viktor leaned back in his chair, satisfied. His smirk widened with each grimace in the crowd. "As expected," he whispered, almost amused. "This is not music, it is noise, and he is lost inside it." His eyes gleamed with triumph. certain that the humiliation he had predicted was unfolding perfectly before him. On stage, Keanu remained unmoved by the hostility around him, his brow furrowed in concentration, his fingers hammering through the chaos with disciplined force. To him, the jarring dissonance was not failure. It was the storm Richter had written, the turbulence meant to shake the listener before any resolution could come. He knew it would sound incomprehensible to many, but he also knew it was exactly where the piece had to begin. The audience, however, grew restless. Whispers turned to open muttering, even a few sharp coughs of disapproval. Some shifted in their seats, glancing at the exits. For them, this was confirmation that the experiment had collapsed. They had come for a spectacle, and now they believed they were watching a disaster. Still, Keanu pressed forward, each measure carrying the weight of nights spent in solitude, each chaotic phrase a test of endurance. His silence before the opening had been no hesitation, it had been a promise. And though the crowd could not yet see it, the storm he unleashed was only the beginning. The storm of notes raged on, jagged and relentless. Each chord struck like a blow. Each run surged forward without pattern, daring the listener to keep pace. To the untrained ear, it sounded like collapse, like an amateur drowning in sound too vast for him to contain. The critics leaned forward with predatory delight, already crafting headlines in their minds. In the third row, a man muttered, "He's lost control." Another replied, "No, he never had it." Their laughter carried just enough to sting, feeding the restless energy of the hall. The more Keanu pressed into the chaos, the more the audience's doubt grew. Viktor, seated among the judges, allowed himself the luxury of a slow exhale, as though a weight had been lifted. The arrogance on his face hardened into satisfaction. To him, this was confirmation of what he had said all along, that art could not be borrowed, that sacrifice was not something a movie star could imitate. He turned to Dubois and murmured, "Do you see? The sonata swallows him whole. He is finished." Dubois gave a single nod, her expression cold, though her eyes lingered a moment longer on Keanu, searching for something she could not yet name. On stage, Keanu felt the current pressing against him, yet he did not resist. He allowed the chaos to unfold exactly as Richter had intended, dissonant and bruising. His fingers pounded against the reinforced keys, each strike an echo of storms he had weathered in silence. He remembered nights when his body had nearly broken, when his spirit had faltered, when doubt had whispered that he was too late. The storm of the sonata was no different. It was a mirror of his own battle. Still, the audience could not see that. To them, the music was unbearable, the hall heavy with impatience. A woman in the balcony shook her head and whispered, "He doesn't belong here." A man beside her smirked, "It's embarrassing, isn't it?" Their words spread like cracks across glass, threatening to shatter the fragile silence that still held between the outbursts of sound. But Keanu did not flinch. His brow furrowed, his body swayed slightly with the rhythm, his breath steady. He was not here to entertain them. He was here to tell the story that Richter had buried in the chaos, the story his mother had once dreamed he would give voice to. Each crashing chord was a step deeper, into the storm, a descent before the possibility of ascent. The murmurs grew, but Keanu stayed inside the storm. To him, the jeers and whispers were no different than the bleeding fingers, the cramped muscles, the endless nights of doubt. They were part of the trial. He had accepted long ago that the world might mock him for even trying. And yet, beneath the storm of Richter's opening, he knew what the critics did. Not that storms eventually give way to silence, and silence to something greater. For now, though, the hall believed he was failing. Viktor's smile widened, reporters' pens flew, and the crowd settled into the comfort of their scorn. None of them realized that they were still only at the beginning. The storm of Richter's sonata roared across the hall, a furious flood of clashing chords and unrelenting dissonance. For long minutes, it seemed as though the chaos had no end, as though Keanu was trapped inside a maze of sound designed to consume him whole. The audience shifted uncomfortably, some whispering with impatience, others smirking at what they believed was certain collapse. And then, something unexpected began to happen. Out of the maelstrom, A single thread of melody slipped through, soft and almost hesitant, like a fragile beam of light breaking through thunderclouds. The shift was so sudden, so startling, that the hall itself seemed to gasp. Conversations fell silent mid-whisper. Pens paused mid-scratch. The air, heavy with derision only moments before, grew still. Keanu's body transformed with the change. Where moments earlier his arms had pounded with force, now they moved with a grace that seemed impossible. His hands flowed across the keys like water, each motion unbroken, seamless, alive. His face, illuminated by the glow of the chandeliers, was serene yet fiercely concentrated. His eyes closed, as though he was listening to something far beyond the hall. The melody swelled slowly, rising from the chaos, like a voice breaking through grief. It was haunting, unearthly in its beauty, the kind of sound that bypassed intellect and struck directly at the heart. Listeners leaned forward involuntarily, drawn into the fragile thread as though their very breath depended on it. The critics who had prepared their pens to write scornful reviews hesitated, struck by the unexpected turn. The phrases unfolding now were not clumsy or lifeless. They carried precision, fused with a vulnerability that made them almost painful to hear. Every note seemed to tremble on the edge of breaking, yet it held, and in holding, it became more powerful. Viktor sat upright, his smirk fading as the storm he had mocked gave way to something undeniable. His fingers, resting on the table, twitched, as though echoing the rhythm unconsciously. He clenched his jaw, unwilling to admit even to himself that the actor's playing had unsettled him. And yet, as the melody deepened, he could not deny it. Keanu was no longer merely surviving the sonata. He was shaping it into something living. Daniel, standing in the shadows near the wings, felt his chest tighten. He had heard Keanu play this passage countless times in the warehouse, seen him stumble, seen him bleed for it, seen him question whether it was possible. But tonight was different. Tonight, the music carried not just effort, but soul. It was not perfect in the academic sense. There were rough edges, small falters, but those imperfections made it human, and in their humanity, breathtaking. The audience, once restless, now leaned forward in silence. Their earlier scorn seemed distant, erased by the melody's fragile beauty. Some closed their eyes to absorb it fully. Others pressed fingers to lips as though afraid to break the spell. The hall, moments ago fractured by whispers, was now unified in awe. And at the center of it all sat Keanu, unmoving except for his hands, channeling storm into serenity, chaos into order. The haunting melody grew, unfolding with the patience of something timeless. Each phrase carried weight, yet it never faltered. The storm had not disappeared. It lingered beneath, a low rumble in the bass, but now it served as contrast, a reminder of the darkness from which beauty had emerged. The audience was transfixed. What had begun as ridicule had turned into reverent silence. The same lips that had sneered moments earlier were parted in awe, their owners caught helplessly in the pull of the sonata. The critics' pens lay idle against paper, their words forgotten as they strained to follow each delicate curve of sound. Keanu's hands moved with a balance that was both exact and fluid. Every strike of the keys was controlled, yet it carried the warmth of vulnerability. His face remained calm, his brow uncreased, his breathing steady. It was as though he had vanished into the music, letting it pass through him without obstruction. A man in the balcony whispered, "This isn't acting, this is..." His voice trailed away, unable to finish the thought. Another audience member wiped away a tear, stunned by how the same chaos they had dismissed had blossomed into something that now felt inevitable, as though the dissonance had always been meant to give birth to this fragile beauty. At the judge's table, Viktor's composure cracked. His smirk was gone, his lips pressed into a thin line, his eyes sharp and restless. He told himself it was a trick, that the audience was being seduced by sentiment. But even as he thought it, his chest betrayed him with a tremor he could not suppress. He had studied Richter's sonata, dismissed it as unplayable, a failed experiment of madness. And yet here it was alive, unfolding in the hands of a man he had mocked. Dubois turned her head toward him briefly, her expression unreadable. She said nothing, but the faint arch of her brow was enough to remind Victor that his certainty was slipping. He shifted in his chair, forcing himself to keep still, unwilling to reveal his unease to anyone watching. The melody reached higher, its fragile voice gaining strength. Keanu's fingers glided effortlessly, like brushstrokes painting sorrow and hope across silence. Each note resonated with the honesty of a man who had suffered, endured, and risen. It was not flawless, but it was true, and in truth, there was perfection. Daniel felt tears prick his eyes as he watched from the wings. He had seen the pain, the bleeding hands, the nights when Keanu nearly gave in to despair. Now, in this moment, it all came together not as triumph over the sonata, but as communion with it. The music was no longer Richter's alone. It was Keanu's, and through him, it belonged to everyone listening. When the melody descended into silence, the hall did not breathe. The storm would return, they knew, but in that pause, the beauty lingered like something eternal. And in that silence, Victor's pride fractured, for he realized the finale he had dismissed was only just beginning. The haunting melody lingered, its final note suspended in silence that seemed to stretch forever. The storm had given way to something unthinkable beauty carved from chaos, and the hall was no longer the same place it had been minutes earlier. The audience that had once laughed, whispered, and shifted impatiently, now sat frozen, caught in a spell they could neither resist nor explain. At the judges' table, the shift was visible. Madame Dubois, who had sat stiff and unyielding through every performance, leaned forward, her hands gripping the railing before her, her lips parted, a whisper escaping almost involuntarily. "This is new." Her voice trembled not with weakness, but with awe, as if she were witnessing a truth she had never imagined. The other judges exchanged glances, their pens forgotten, their notes abandoned. Their faces betrayed what they would not yet say aloud. This was not the collapse they had expected. Something extraordinary was unfolding before them, something that defied the categories by which they had judged music for decades. The audience, too, felt the change. Men and women who had smirked minutes earlier now wiped at their eyes, embarrassed by the tears they could not hold back. Couples leaned into one another, hands clasping tightly as though to anchor themselves in the tide of sound. Students and critics alike sat in silence, undone by the force of a performance they could not dismiss as mere spectacle. The mockery that had once filled the hall was gone, replaced by reverence. Backstage, Daniel stood in the shadows, his throat tight with emotion. He had believed in Keanu when no one else had watched him suffer through the pain of perseverance, had seen him nearly break. Now, as the sonata breathed life into the hall, Daniel could hardly contain himself. "He did it," he whispered, voice catching. He gave her voice. The words carried the weight of years, the fulfillment of a promise born not in ambition, but in formant love. On stage, Keanu played with a serenity that belied the storm he had endured. His body was still, his hands moving with a grace that seemed almost otherworldly. Each note carried precision, sharpened by discipline, yet softened by vulnerability. It was a fusion no tutor could have taught, no tradition could have prescribed. It was the language of a man who had suffered and survived, who had chosen to bare his soul before the world without fear of ridicule. And for the first time in decades, Maestro Viktor Armand felt his certainty falter. He sat rigid, his fingers tapping the table unconsciously, his smirk gone. He could not categorize what he was hearing. It was not the flawless precision of the prodigies he admired, nor the fiery passion of the virtuosos he trained. It was something raw, unrefined, yet undeniable. It carried a truth he had not expected, and truth was harder to dismiss than skill. As the sonata unfolded, the hall itself seemed to transform. The chandeliers no longer glittered with opulence. They shimmered with a softer light, as though bowing to the sound. The velvet seats, once filled with restless bodies, now held an audience unified by awe. And in that unity, something greater than competition was born, a reminder that music was not merely performance, but revelation. The melody deepened, carrying the hall into silence so profound that even the smallest sounds, a cough, a shifting chair, felt intrusive. The very audience that had once mocked him now leaned forward, captivated. They were no longer critics, no longer skeptics. They were witnesses to something they could not explain, a force that demanded surrender rather than judgment. Keanu's hands glided across the keys with unbroken fluidity. His movements were restrained, controlled, yet every note radiated with the pulse of something living. His face revealed nothing of showmanship, only focus, calm, serene, intense. It was as though he had vanished into the sonata, allowing it to speak through him without interference. The chaos that had once jarred their ears now seemed essential, a necessary path to arrive at the fragile beauty filling the hall. In the balcony, a woman who had whispered scorn at the start now pressed a hand to her lips, tears streaming down her cheeks. Beside her, the same man who had smirked earlier sat frozen, his eyes wide with disbelief. All around them, shoulders shook quietly, hands gripped tightly together. The audience was no longer listening with their ears but with their hearts. Madame Dubois' knuckles whitened as she held the railing tighter. For decades, she had demanded precision, worshipped tradition, condemned any deviation from the canon. Yet now, confronted with this sound, she felt something she had not felt in years: wonder. Her whisper had escaped earlier, but now it grew into conviction. "This is new," she murmured again, louder this time, almost reverent. She realized, with a tremor in her chest, that she was hearing a birth, not of a pianist, but of a new voice in music itself. Backstage, Daniel's hands shook as he leaned against the frame of the curtain. He could no longer contain the flood of emotion. He had seen Keanu suffer, bleed, doubt, nearly collapse. And now, the music had transformed that suffering into light. A gift not only to the hall, but to the woman whose memory still lived in Keanu's heart. "He gave her voice," Daniel whispered again, his words breaking with emotion. For him, this was no competition, it was redemption. And then there was Viktor. The maestro sat stiffly, staring at the stage, with eyes that betrayed a storm within. He wanted to dismiss it, to call it luck, to accuse the crowd of being blinded by sentiment. Yet, he could not. His chest tightened with a realization he could not ignore. For the first time, he doubted himself. His certainty, his pride, the foundation of his authority, all trembled under the weight of what he was hearing. He saw, in Keanu's performance, not defiance, but truth, and truth was more dangerous than defiance. As the melody soared higher, the hall transformed into something beyond marble and chandeliers. It became a sanctuary where time stopped, where judgment dissolved, and where every soul present was bound together by the same fragile, breathtaking sound. Keanu had not only changed the music, he had changed them. The sonata surged forward, gathering force like a tidal wave. The haunting melody that had silenced the hall did not fade but began to intertwine with new layers, swelling in power, colliding with fragments of chaos that returned sharper, more furious, more insistent. The hall vibrated under the weight of it, the chandeliers trembling as though the very air could not contain the sound. Keanu's body remained steady, his posture calm, but his hands were a blur. They raced across the keys with impossible speed, each run so fast the eye could barely follow. Yet within the speed there was precision, no frantic thrashing, no wild abandon. Every note landed exactly where it belonged, building towards something greater. His fingers leapt from one register to another, weaving overlapping melodies that danced and clashed, climbing toward heights few had ever dared attempt. The audience gripped their seats. Some gasped aloud as the sheer velocity of sound grew overwhelming. It was not just music anymore. It was force. It was storm. It was the sensation of reality, bending beneath pressure. People felt it in their bones, in the pounding of their chests, as if the piano itself had become a living creature roaring against the silence of the world. Daniel, backstage, could barely breathe. His hands clutched the curtain as he watched his friend ascend into the impossible. This was the moment he had seen in fragments during long nights in the warehouse. but never like this. Keanu was not only playing, he was transcending. The pain, the sacrifice, the sleepless nights, it was all being released here, pouring into a final battle with the sonata that had once threatened to destroy him. At the judges' table, Madame Dubois covered her mouth with trembling fingers. She had heard virtuosos perform feats that defied belief, but nothing like this. The runs were not just fast, they were layered with emotion so raw that her chest ached. It was not perfection alone, it was truth, relentless and unfiltered, breaking through every tradition she had clung to. Viktor sat frozen, his hands gripping the arms of his chair. His mind screamed to dismiss it, to find fault, to hold on to his certainty, but his body betrayed him. His pulse hammered, his throat tightened, and his eyes widened as the sonata climbed higher, refusing to yield. For the first time in decades, he was not the master of his own judgment. He was simply a man confronted with something greater than pride. The music thundered now, chords crashing like waves, overlapping until they seemed to swallow the hall whole. The melody soared above them, clear and defiant, as though singing through the storm. Every note carried the weight of Keanu's vow, the echo of his mother's dream, the truth of a man who had refused to surrender. And then, with a sudden ferocity, he struck the final passage, impossible runs cascading like lightning, thunderous chords shaking the hall, the sonata driving toward its last breath. The final ascent began with a fury so intense that the audience felt as if the floor beneath them might collapse. Keanu's hands blurred across the keys, both racing and colliding, pulling fragments of the sonata into a single unstoppable stream. The low end thundered with booming chords, while the high end screamed with piercing runs, the two voices clashing and uniting in a storm that defied logic. It was more than human. No one could imagine such precision at such speed, and yet it was happening before their eyes. Each overlapping melody was distinct, yet woven into a tapestry so vast it felt cosmic. The hall seemed to expand with the sound, as though the walls and ceiling could not contain the energy spilling forth. Some members of the audience had tears streaming down their faces, though they could not explain why. The music carried them beyond words, beyond understanding. It was not only the story of Richter's vision, it was Keanu's life, his grief, his resilience, his vow to honor the mother who had once whispered that music could heal the soul. They could feel his love in the force of his playing, his loss in the shadows of the minor keys, his hope in the triumphant melodies that rose above the chaos. "Backstage," Daniel whispered, barely audible even to himself. "He's giving her voice." His chest shook with emotion. He had seen Keanu bleed, break, and rebuild himself for this moment, and now it was unfolding in a torrent that left him overwhelmed. He knew this performance was not simply about winning a prize. It was about fulfillment, about keeping a promise written in the quiet of grief. At the judges' table, Madame Dubois gripped the railing so tightly her knuckles went white. Her eyes were wide, her breath caught in her throat. Every rule she had enforced, every doctrine she had defended, was shattering under the weight of what she was hearing. This was not rebellion for its own sake. It was creation raw, defiant, and breathtaking. Viktor's smirk had long since vanished. His lips trembled as he leaned forward, his eyes locked on Keanu's hands. He wanted to call it arrogance, to dismiss it as trickery, but he could not. What filled the hall was not trickery. It was truth, and it was breaking him. For the first time, doubt stabbed at him. Was this the future of music? Was his life of sacrifice being eclipsed in front of his eyes? The climax arrived in a blaze of thunder. Keanu's arms rose and fell with commanding force, both hands striking chords that shook the hall like earthquakes. Overlapping voices converged, colliding, into one final surge. His entire body seemed to vibrate with the sound, his face serene yet fierce, his chest rising and falling with deep, controlled breaths. The piano itself groaned under the strain, yet the sound remained pure, alive, defiant. And then it came the last chord. impossibly huge, struck with both hands stretched wide across the keys. It rang through the hall like a bell, tolling across eternity. The vibrations lingered in the chandeliers, in the velvet seats, in the hearts of every person present. Silence followed. 10 seconds of absolute stillness. The audience did not breathe. The hall had transformed into a cathedral of quiet awe. Every face was frozen, eyes wide, hearts pounding, trying to comprehend what they had just witnessed. The final chord lingered, its echo dissolving into a silence that was heavier than sound. 10 seconds stretched into eternity. The audience sat frozen, unwilling to break the fragile stillness, as if any noise would shatter what they had just experienced. Faces were pale with awe, hands suspended in midair, eyes locked on the man seated at the piano. Then, from the highest balcony, a single clap rang out. It was hesitant at first, the sound of one person unable to keep silent. Heads turned upward. Another clap followed, sharper, stronger. Then another. The stillness cracked, and a murmur spread like ripples across water. In an instant, the hall erupted. Applause thundered, cascading from every level of the grand theater. People leapt to their feet, cheering, shouting, stamping their feet against the marble floors. The roar was unlike anything this hall had ever contained. It was not the polite, measured ovation reserved for tradition. It was raw, unrestrained, almost chaotic in its passion. The chandeliers swayed as the sound reverberated through the walls. Patrons who had sneered hours before now clapped until their palms stung. Some cried openly, unable to contain the release of emotion that Keanu's performance had awakened in them. The air was thick with disbelief and joy, a wave of energy surging forward toward the stage. Backstage, Daniel pressed both hands to his face. He had prepared himself for applause, but nothing like this. His chest heaved, tears cutting through the exhaustion etched into his features. Whispering through the noise, he said to himself, "He did it." He gave her voice. On stage, Madame Dubois rose slowly from her seat, her body trembling. For decades, she had guarded the sanctity of tradition with iron resolve. Now tears glistened on her cheeks, her throat tightening as she brought her hands together. She clapped, not with restraint, but with abandon, surrendering to the revelation she had just witnessed. The other judges followed, each standing, each applauding in a state of dazed reverence. They exchanged glances, none daring to speak. Words had no place here. This was not a moment for analysis or judgment. It was a moment of surrender to something greater than any of them had believed possible. All eyes turned to Viktor. For long moments he remained seated, his face hidden in shadow, his hands gripping the arms of his chair. His eyes were locked on Keanu, the man he had mocked, dismissed, and condemned. His chest rose and fell with uneven breaths. The applause roared around him, but inside he fought a battle between pride and truth. Finally, slowly, he pushed himself to his feet. His posture was no longer the rigid stance of superiority. His shoulders sagged, his face etched with lines of defeat and something new humility. His lips moved, and though his words were drowned by the ovation, those nearest to him heard, "Perhaps I was wrong." Keanu did not bask in the storm of applause. He did not raise his arms, did not bow theatrically, did not linger in the triumph he had earned. Instead, he rose from the bench with the same calm humility that had carried him onto the stage. His chest rose and fell with a single steady breath. He looked out at the sea of faces, at the thousands who stood shouting his name and clapping until the hall itself seemed alive. He lowered his head in a quiet bow. It was not the bow of a conqueror but of a servant, an acknowledgement that what they had heard did not belong to him alone. He had given voice to something greater than himself, and he understood that. The ovation only grew louder. People stamped their feet, desperate to prolong the moment. Yet Keanu did not seek to stretch it further. With slow, deliberate steps, he turned away from the piano and began walking off stage. Each step echoed beneath the roar, a stark contrast to the wild energy he left behind. As he neared the curtain, he paused once. His gaze lifted to the balcony where the first clap had broken the silence. There, a young woman stood, tears streaming down her face, her hands still pressed together. She seemed unaware of the crowd, lost in her own revelation. Keanu gave her the faintest nod, a silent recognition of the courage it had taken to stand first. Back in the hall, Madame Dubois' tears flowed freely. She whispered to herself, though no one could hear, This is new. She had witnessed countless performances, each brilliant in its way, but this was something beyond brilliance. It was transformation. It was art reborn. The crowd refused to stop. Even as Keanu disappeared behind the curtain, the applause thundered on, echoing like waves against stone. People embraced one another, strangers united in disbelief. Conversations broke out between bursts of clapping. Did you hear that passage? How was it possible? I've never felt anything like it. Tradition had been shattered, and in its place stood a revelation that none could deny. Backstage, Daniel caught Keanu by the shoulders the moment he stepped into the shadows. His face was streaked with tears, his voice breaking. You did it. You gave her dream life again. Keanu's expression softened, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his lips. It wasn't just mine to give, he said quietly. It belonged to her, and now it belongs to them too. Daniel's voice cracked. You don't know what you just did out there. You changed everything. Keanu shook his head gently. I only played. The music did the rest. Out in the hall, the ovation still raged on. Viktor stood motionless among the clapping crowd, his eyes fixed on the empty stage. For years, he had defined himself as the gatekeeper of truth in music. Now, for the first time, he felt the gates creak open. His whisper, lost in the roar, carried the weight of surrender. Perhaps I was wrong. The ovation thundered on long after Keanu disappeared into the wings, echoing through the vast concert hall, until it felt less like applause and more like a collective heartbeat. For the judges, the moment demanded immediate deliberation, but as they entered their chamber, order dissolved into chaos. Madame Dubois stood at the head of the table, her eyes still wet with tears. The younger judges spoke first, their voices urgent, almost pleading. We have never seen anything like this. It wasn't just technical, it was transformative. It changed what music can be. One of the older members slammed his fist against the table. It was chaos. It was spectacle. It was not Chopin, not Beethoven. It was not tradition. If we reward this, we betray everything this hall was built to protect. Their words collided like clashing chords, voices rising and falling as the room divided itself between past and future. Some argued that to crown him the winner would mean discarding centuries of discipline. Others countered that to deny him would be to blind themselves to genius. Her mind replayed the moment she had gripped the railing, whispering to herself that what she heard was new. She remembered the hush that fell over her heart when the melody emerged from chaos. For her, the decision had already been made, though she let the storm rage before finally raising her hand. The room fell silent. We are not judges of history, she said, her voice steady, though her heart trembled. We are judges of music. Tonight, music changed. It revealed a voice that did not fit within our traditions, but that does not make it less true. To deny what we witnessed would not protect art, it would bury it. No one spoke after that. Even those who had opposed her felt the weight of truth in her words. Slowly, reluctantly, the room shifted. The decision was made. Back in the hall, the audience had not settled. They waited, buzzing with restless energy, demanding resolution. When the judges filed back to the stage, the crowd hushed, anticipation thick in the air. Madame Dubois stepped forward, her hands trembling as she held the envelope. For over a century, she began, this competition has celebrated the highest achievement in piano performance. Tonight, we were confronted not only with mastery, but with something beyond mastery, a performance that expanded what music could mean. The decision was not easy, but it was clear. She paused, her eyes sweeping across the audience before landing on Keanu, standing quietly at the side of the stage. The winner of this year's International Piano Gala is Keanu Reeves. The hall erupted. The ovation returned in a wave that shook the rafters. People shouted his name, stamping and cheering with an energy that defied every tradition of restraint. For once, the rules of decorum crumbled. What remained was raw celebration. Backstage, Viktor lingered in the shadows. His eyes were heavy, his pride fractured, but he walked forward slowly until he stood before Keanu. The maestro who had once sneered now spoke with quiet humility. "You silenced me," he admitted, his voice rough, not with arrogance, but with truth. Keanu's reply was soft, almost a whisper. "Music belongs to everyone, maestro, even to those told they don't belong." Viktor stood silent for a moment, the words striking him more deeply than he expected. All his life, he had fought to preserve what he believed was purity. Yet here, in front of him, was a man who had shown that purity was not about walls, but about opening doors. For the first time, the maestro lowered his head, not in defeat, but in respect. Keanu placed a hand gently on Viktor's shoulder. No bitterness, no triumph, only quiet understanding. Without another word, he walked away, leaving the maestro staring at the ground, humbled but strangely at peace. The trophy felt heavy when it was finally pressed into Keanu's hands. The polished metal caught the light of the chandeliers, but he did not lift it to the crowd. He simply held it against his chest for a moment before bowing again, humility radiating from his every movement. The crowd responded with renewed cheers, though Keanu did not stay to soak in their adoration. He carried the trophy off stage like a man carrying something sacred. Later that night, when the hall had emptied and the noise had faded into memory, Keanu sat alone in his quiet home. The lights were dim, the world hushed. On the table before him lay an old notebook, its pages worn, its corners bent from years of being carried and cherished. It was his mother's. He opened to the familiar page, the one where her handwriting curved delicately across the lines. Music can heal the soul. His fingers brushed across the ink, his throat tightening with the weight of memory. Beside the notebook, he placed the gleaming trophy. The contrast was stark, one object humble and fragile, the other radiant and solid. Together they told a story that words could never capture. Leaning close, Keanu whispered, "This was for you." His voice cracked with emotion, yet in it was peace. He had carried her dream into the world, and tonight it had finally sung. The room was still, yet alive with memory. In that moment, Keanu did not feel like a winner of competitions, nor a movie star proving critics wrong. He felt like a son, keeping a promise that transcended time. The story of the evening spread quickly. Headlines across the world captured the shock and wonder of the performance, the fall of arrogance, and the rise of something unexpected. But for Keanu, none of that mattered. What mattered was that the music had spoken, not only for him, but for his mother, and perhaps for anyone who had ever been told they didn't belong. And so this story closes not with noise, but with reflection. If you believe art can come from the most unexpected places, share this incredible story. Do you think tradition should be protected, or should new voices redefine it? Tell us in the comments.